Story 1. My wife secretly spent the night at her ex's place. She swears nothing happened, but I feel betrayed. The text message came at 2:47 a.m. I know because I'd been staring at my phone for hours, watching the minutes crawl by while Sarah's side of the bed remained cold and empty. Staying at a friend's tonight, phone died, home tomorrow. That was it. No explanation. No apology for the worry she must have known I'd feel when she finally walked through our front door the next morning. Her hair was different messier than when she'd left for what she claimed was a girls' night out with her college roommate, Jessica. Her clothes were wrinkled, and she wouldn't meet my eyes as she mumbled something about Jessica's couch being uncomfortable. "How's Jessica doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while I poured coffee into 2 mugs, a morning ritual we'd shared for 8 years of marriage. Sarah paused too long before answering. She's good. Same old Jessica, you know?" But I didn't know, because when I called Jessica later that afternoon to thank her for looking after my wife, she sounded genuinely confused. "Sarah? No, I haven't seen Sarah in months. We keep meaning to get together, but you know how it is, with work and everything." The truth came out in pieces over the following days, like pulling teeth. First, Sarah admitted she hadn't been with Jessica. Then, after more pressing, she revealed she'd run into her ex-boyfriend Michael at a bar downtown. Finally, 3 days of tense silence later, she confessed she'd gone back to his apartment. "Nothing happened, David," she insisted, her green eyes pleading with me to believe her. "I swear on my mother's grave, nothing happened. We just talked. About old times, about where our lives went. I fell asleep on his couch, and my phone was dead. I should have found a way to call you, I know that, but nothing happened." The thing is, I want to believe her. Sarah has never been a liar, not in all the years I've known her. When she forgot my birthday 2 years ago, she admitted it immediately, instead of pretending she had something planned. When she accidentally scratched Mrs. Peterson's car in the grocery store parking lot, she left a note with her insurance information, even though no one saw her do it. But this feels different. The secrecy, the lies about Jessica, the way she can't, seem to look directly at me when she talks about that night. It all points to something more than innocent conversation between old friends. Michael Thompson. I remember him from the few times Sarah mentioned him in our early dating days. Tall, athletic, worked in marketing for some tech startup. They dated for 2 years in college before she transferred schools and met me. She always described their relationship as intense but unstable, which I took to mean passionate in ways that may be ours. WASN, single quotes T. Sarah and I were the steady type. We bought a house in the suburbs, planned for kids, discussed retirement accounts over dinner. We don't fight much, but we don't make each other's hearts race either. We're comfortable, predictable, safe. Maybe that's the problem. That night, over and over in my mind, trying to understand what led her there. Had she seemed distant lately? Was there something I missed? Some sign that she was unhappy or restless? Looking back, I can see small things, the way she'd stare out the kitchen window while doing dishes, how she'd sometimes seem lost in thought. During our evening TV time, the way she'd started going out more often with vague explanations about meeting friends. The betrayal isn't just about what may or may not have happened in Michael's apartment. It's about the lies, the deception. The fact that she chose to seek comfort or conversation or whatever it was with someone else instead of coming to me. It's about learning that my wife of 8 years could look me in the eye for 3 days and lie about where she'd been and who she'd been with. We're seeing a marriage counselor now. Dr. Martinez says trust can be rebuilt. But it takes time and complete honesty from both parties. Sarah has agreed to cut all contact with Michael and to be more transparent about her whereabouts. She's shown me her phone, given me passwords, done everything she can think of to prove her commitment to our marriage. But late at night, when I lie in bed listening to her breathe beside me, I still wonder about that night, about what they talked about for hours, about whether she thought of me at all while she was there, about whether the woman lying next to me is the same person I married, or if she's someone I never really knew at all. The hardest part is that I love her. Despite everything, despite the doubt that eats at me, despite the way my stomach clenches when she's 10 minutes late coming home from work, I still love her, and I think that might be the most terrifying part of all. Story 2. my husband started taking evening runs with a woman he met at our kids' daycare. I think this crosses boundaries. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how Tom presented it to me. He'd been complaining for months about his lack of exercise, about how his back ached from sitting at his computer all day, about how he felt sluggish and out of shape. When he announced he was going to start running again, I was thrilled. The Tom I married 15 years ago had been a marathon runner, lean and energetic, always ready for weekend hikes or bike rides. I met someone at Emma's daycare who runs, he said one Tuesday evening, lacing up the running shoes he dug out of our closet. Rachel Morrison, her son Jack, is in Emma's class. She invited me to join her group. I thought it was wonderful that our 6-year-old was already helping us make parent connections. The other mothers I'd met during pickup were pleasant enough. But I'd always been too rushed or too tired to develop real friendships. Maybe this would be good for both of us. The first few runs, Tom came home energized and talkative, telling me about the route they'd taken, how good it felt to be active again, how the group was small but welcoming. But as the weeks passed, I noticed the group seemed to consist mainly of Tom and Rachel. "Where are the other runners?" I asked one evening, as he returned, cheeks flushed and breathing hard. "Oh, you know how it is. People drop off. Rachel's really committed, though. She's training for a half marathon." Rachel Morrison. I started paying attention when I picked Emma up from daycare, looking for the woman who was becoming such a fixture in my husband's routine. When I finally spotted her, I understood why Tom was so motivated to keep running. She was everything I wasn't, tall and lean, with the kind of effortless ponytail that looked perfect even after a workout. Her laugh carried across the playground, as she chatted with other parents, confident and social, in a way that made my own reserved nature feel inadequate. The evening runs became longer. What started as 45-minute jogs stretched to an hour, then 90 minutes. Tom would come home later and later, explaining that they'd decided to extend their route or stopped for water at a park. He'd shower immediately, singing in a way he hadn't in years, then join Emma and me for dinner with stories about his training progress. I wanted to be supportive, I really did. When Tom suggested I should start running too, maybe join them. Sometime, I even bought new running shoes and athletic clothes. But the one time I mentioned actually doing it, Tom seemed flustered. "It's pretty intense," he said. "Rachel's really focused on her training schedule. Maybe you should start with shorter distances first, work up to it." That's when the doubt crept in. My husband, who had always been encouraging about my fitness attempts, who had cheered me through Pilates classes and yoga DVDs, was suddenly protective of his running routine. He was gatekeeping something that should have been an open invitation. To get healthy together, I started noticing other changes too. Tom would check his phone more frequently, smiling at messages he didn't share. He bought new running clothes, expensive moisture-wicking shirts that he modeled in the mirror before heading out. He started talking about nutrition and hydration, strategies, terms he'd learned from running forums, but that sounded suspiciously like conversations with someone who knew these things personally. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. Tom had left for his run, as usual, but Emma had forgotten her favorite stuffed animal at daycare. When I drove back to get it, I saw them in the parking lot not running, just standing by Rachel's car, talking intently. Tom's hand was on her arm, and she was looking up at him with an expression that made my stomach drop. They weren't doing anything wrong, not technically. But there was an intimacy to their body language, a connection that felt like more than training partners. When Tom came home that night, later than usual, I asked how the run went. "Great," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Really pushed ourselves." Tonight, I almost asked him about the parking lot, about why they weren't actually running when I saw them, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what he might say, or maybe it was the terrible suspicion that I already knew the answer. Marriage hasn't been perfect lately. We've fallen into routines, gotten comfortable in ways that maybe aren't healthy. We're both busy with work and Emma, and it's been months since we've had a real conversation that wasn't about schedules or bills or household logistics. Maybe years since we've looked at each other the way Tom looked at Rachel in that parking lot. But does that justify this? These evening disappearances, the secrecy, the way he lights up when he talks about someone else. Emma asks why Daddy is always running now, why he can't play with her after dinner anymore. I don't know what to tell her, because I'm not sure I understand it myself, I want to trust my husband. I want to believe that this is just about fitness and friendship and rediscovering his love of running. But trust requires honesty, and Tom seems to be sharing less and less about these evening adventures. The man who used to tell me about every mundane detail of his workday now guards his running stories like state secrets. Tonight, he's lacing up his shoes again, humming that same tune, and I'm left wondering if I'm losing my husband one evening run at a time, or if I'm just being paranoid about something perfectly innocent. The worst part is, I don't know which answer scares me more. Story 3. My husband deleted all his social media apps right before his surgery. The notification popped up on my phone at 11:43 p.m. Mark Johnson is no longer on Facebook. I stared at the screen, confused. We'd been married for 12 years, and Mark had been practically glued to his phone for the last 5 of them. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. He scrolled through them constantly, commenting on old high school friends' posts, sharing memes about golf and dad jokes, documenting our family's weekend adventures. His knee surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Nothing major, just arthroscopic repair from an old sports injury that had been bothering him for months. We'd talked about it extensively, the procedure, the recovery time, how I'd need to help him get around for the first week. But we'd never discussed him going completely dark on social media. When I brought it up the next morning over coffee, Mark shrugged it off. I just want to focus on recovery without distractions. All that scrolling isn't good for me anyway. It seemed reasonable enough, even admirable. I'd been telling him for years that he spent too much time on his phone. But something about the timing felt odd. Why delete everything the night before surgery instead of just taking a break afterward? The surgery went smoothly. Dr. Peterson said everything looked better than expected, and Mark would be back to normal activities within 6 weeks. I drove him home, got him settled on the couch with pillows propping up his leg, and prepared for what I thought would be a week of playing nursemaid to a restless patient. But Mark wasn't restless. He was almost eerily calm. Instead of reaching for his phone every few minutes like usual, he read actual books. He watched cooking shows with genuine interest. He asked me about my day at the accounting firm and actually listened to my answers. It was like living with a completely different persona, better version of my husband. 3 days into his recovery, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and immediately turned the phone face down, but not before I caught sight of a name I didn't recognize. Ashley M. Who's Ashley? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. From work? He said quickly. Just checking on how the surgery went. Mark worked in IT for a large corporation. He'd mentioned various coworkers over the years, but never an Ashley. I'd been to enough company picnics and holiday parties to know most of his colleagues, at least by name. That night, while Mark slept heavily thanks to his pain medication, I did something I'd never done before. I looked through his phone. My hands shook as I entered his passcode wedding anniversary and opened his messages. The text thread with Ashley M. went back 3 months. At first, the messages were work-related, discussions about server maintenance and software updates. But gradually, they became more personal. Ashley asking about his injury, Mark complaining about feeling underappreciated at home, her suggesting they grab lunch to talk more privately. The messages stopped abruptly for days ago, the night he deleted his social media. I found more evidence in his email, messages about meeting for coffee, discussions about their respective marriages, complaints about spouses who didn't understand them. Ashley was clearly going through a rough patch with her husband, and Mark was positioning himself as the sympathetic friend who truly got her situation. The final email, sent the day before his surgery, was Mark telling Ashley he needed to step back and focus on his family during his recovery. He said he was deleting social media to avoid temptation and suggested they keep their relationship strictly professional going forward. I sat in our kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the evidence of my husband's emotional affair, and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Mark had recognized where things were heading and had made the choice to stop. The surgery, it seemed, had given him an excuse to create boundaries and refocus on our marriage. But the betrayal still stung. For months, he'd been sharing his dissatisfactions about our relationship with another woman instead of talking to me. He'd been planning coffee dates and lunch meetings while I assumed he was working late. The man I'd been living with had been keeping a significant part of his life secret. When I confronted him the next morning, Mark broke down completely. He admitted everything: the friendship that had crossed lines, the emotional intimacy he'd developed with Ashley, the guilt that had been eating at him for weeks. He swore nothing physical had happened, but acknowledged that it might have. He hadn't pulled back. "The surgery made me realize how much I needed you," he said through tears. "Lying there in the hospital, all I could think about was how stupid I'd been. You're my wife, my partner." Ashley was just ... an escape from feeling ordinary. We're in counseling now. Dr. Reynolds says emotional affairs are often harder to recover from than physical ones, because they involve sharing the intimacy that should be reserved for spouses. Mark has been completely transparent. He's shown me his phone, his email, everything. He's even switched departments at work to avoid daily contact with Ashley. The social media apps remain deleted. Mark says he doesn't miss the constant noise, the pressure to present a perfect life online. Ironically, his digital detox has made our relationship more authentic than it's been in years. We talk more, really talk, about our feelings and frustrations. Instead of just coordinating schedules, I'm still hurt, still working through the trust issues. But I'm also grateful that Mark chose our marriage over whatever fantasy he was building with Ashley. Sometimes it takes almost losing something to remember its true value. Story 4. I found out my girlfriend hung out with a male friend multiple times, but she didn't tell me in advance. I accused her of cheating. The photos showed up on Instagram 3 days after the fact. Lisa laughing at some outdoor cafe with a guy I'd never seen before, their heads close together over shared appetizers. Another shot of them at what looked like a bookstore, him pointing at something on a shelf while she smiled up at him. The timestamp showed they were taken last Saturday, the day she told me she was spending with her sister. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through the tagged photos. This wasn't some group hangout or chance encounter. These were clearly planned activities between two people who were comfortable with each other, who had inside jokes and shared interests. The way he had his hand on her shoulder in one photo made my chest tight with something I didn't want to name. I called Lisa immediately. "Who is Derek Walsh?" I demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. There was a pause. "How do you know about Derek?" "Instagram." "Want to explain why you lied to me about spending Saturday with your sister?" "I didn't lie," Lisa said, but her voice had that defensive edge it got when she was caught off guard. "I mean, I did see Sarah, but Derek was in town visiting, and you decided not to mention that you were going on dates with some random guy." "They weren't dates, Jason. Derek is an old friend from college. He lives in Portland now and was here for work. We grabbed lunch and did some shopping. That's it." But it wasn't "that's it," and we both knew it. As the argument escalated, more details emerged. Derek hadn't just been in town. Once he'd visited 3 times in the past 2 months, and Lisa had hung out with him each time. Coffee dates, museum visits, long walks through downtown. All activities she'd somehow forgotten to mention to me, her boyfriend of 2 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I hated how my voice cracked on the question, because I knew you'd react exactly like this, Lisa shot back. You'd get jealous and possessive and ruin a perfectly innocent friendship. The word jealous hit like a slap. Maybe I was jealous, but wasn't I entitled to be? We'd been exclusive for 2 years, talked about moving in together, made plans for the future. Finding out she was secretly spending time with another man felt like a betrayal, regardless of her intentions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Derek's face in those photos, younger than me, better looking, probably more successful. Given that he could afford to visit different cities for work, I imagined their conversations, wondered what they talked about during those long walks, questioned whether Lisa's laughter in the photos looked different than when she laughed with me. The rational part of my brain knew I was spiraling. Lisa had never given me reason to doubt her before. She was typically honest to a fault, the kind of person who'd return extra change to cashiers and confess if she accidentally took someone else's coffee order. But the hurt part of my brain, the part that felt deceived and excluded, kept whispering that innocent friends don't keep secrets. I confronted her again the next day, this time with a direct accusation. "Are you cheating on me with Derek?" Lisa's face went white. "How can you ask me that? How can you think that about me? Because you've been lying about seeing him. Because you look happier in those photos than you've looked with me in months. Because you're sharing parts of your life with him that you're not sharing with me." The fight that followed was brutal. Lisa accused me of being controlling and paranoid. I accused her of being secretive and emotionally unfaithful. We said things designed to hurt each other, dredged up old grievances and insecurities. By the end, we were both crying and exhausted. 3 days of silence followed. I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past few months, looking for signs I'd missed. Had she been distant? Was she less interested in our weekend plans? Did she seem distracted when we were together? The truth, when it finally came out, was more complicated than either cheating or innocence. Lisa admitted she'd been unhappy in our relationship for a while, but hadn't known how to address it. Derek represented something she felt was missing intellectual. Conversations, spontaneous adventures, the excitement of connecting with someone new. She swore nothing physical had happened, but acknowledged that she'd been emotionally invested in their friendship in ways that crossed boundaries. I didn't tell you about Derek because I knew it was wrong, she said when we finally talked. Not wrong like cheating, but wrong like I was getting something from him that I should have been getting from you. Or asking you for. The admission hurt almost more than if she'd just had a physical affair. It meant our relationship had problems. I hadn't even recognized that she'd been unhappy enough to seek emotional fulfillment. Elsewhere, rather than work on things with me, we're taking a break now. Lisa is seeing a therapist to figure out what she wants, and I'm trying to understand why my first instinct was accusation rather than conversation. Maybe if I'd asked about her needs instead of demanding explanations about Derek, we could have worked through this together. The photos are still on Instagram. Sometimes I look at them and see evidence of betrayal. Other times, I see a woman who was trying to rediscover parts of herself she'd lost. I'm not sure which interpretation is correct. Or if maybe they both are. Story 5. My friend is stealing my life stories for her dating apps. I discovered it completely by accident. My coworker Mike was showing me profiles on Bumble during our lunch break, swiping through potential matches with the casual enthusiasm of someone who'd been single for exactly 3 weeks. He paused on one profile, squinting at the screen. "This girl sounds familiar," he said, reading aloud. She rescued a golden retriever from a puppy mill, traveled solo through Southeast Asia for 3 months, and once got stuck in an elevator with a celebrity chef who taught her how to make the perfect scrambled eggs. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Those weren't just familiar stories, they were my stories. Down to the detail about the celebrity chef being Gordon Ramsay's sous chef from Hell's Kitchen. "Can I see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart hammered against my ribs. The profile belonged to Jennifer Davis, my friend. Of 5 years, the photos were definitely her, the blonde hair, the bright smile, the yoga pose on a beach in Thailand. But the stories that made up her personality, her conversation starters, her supposedly unique experiences, they were mine. Every single one of them. The golden retriever rescue was Charlie, who I'd adopted from a horrific breeding situation in Ohio 2 years ago. The Southeast Asia trip had been my post-college adventure, funded by a year of working. Double shifts at a restaurant. The elevator incident had happened to me at a hotel in Chicago during a work conference. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, barely able to concentrate on my accounting spreadsheets. By the time I got home, I'd worked myself into a fury that surprised me with its intensity. These weren't just stories Jennifer had borrowed or embellished. They were the defining moments of my adult life, the experiences that made me who I was. That evening, I called her directly. "Jennifer, we need to talk." "What's up?" she sounded, genuinely cheerful, which somehow made it worse. "I saw your Bumble profile today. Want to explain why you're claiming you rescued Charlie?" The silence stretched so long, I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she laughed, actually laughed. "Oh my God, you saw that? Look, Sarah, you have such amazing stories, and my life is so boring compared to yours. I just borrowed a few details. To make myself sound more interesting, you didn't borrow them, you stole them. Those are my experiences, my memories. How would you feel if I started telling people I grew up on your family's farm in Iowa?" "That's different," Jennifer said, though she couldn't explain how. Over the next hour, the full extent of her theft emerged. It wasn't just the dating app she'd been using my stories at work parties during first dates, even with mutual friends who somehow hadn't connected the dots. My summer working at a ranch in Montana had become her adventure. my experience getting food poisoning in Bangkok. To navigate a Thai hospital had become her funny travel story. Even my grandmother's secret recipe for apple pie, passed down through 4 generations, had somehow become a family tradition Jennifer shared with potential boyfriends. "I don't understand why you're so upset," she said when I demanded she change her profiles. "It's not like you're using these stories to date anyone. You've been with David for 3 years." That comment revealed so much about how Jennifer saw our friendship. To her, my experiences were just unused material, sitting there available for anyone who might need them more than I did. The fact that I was in a committed relationship meant my interesting past was somehow fair game for her romantic pursuits, but it went deeper than just the dating apps. I realized Jennifer had been appropriating my life for years, in small ways that I'd dismissed as coincidence or shared interests. When I mentioned loving a particular author, she'd discover them the next week and post enthusiastic reviews online. When I shared photos from a hiking trip, she'd visit the same location within a month and post nearly identical shots. I'd attributed it to admiration or inspiration, but now I saw it for what it was: systematic identity theft. The worst part was discovering how successful her strategy had been. Through mutual friends, I learned that Jennifer had gotten several second dates by charming men with her stories about volunteering at animal shelters and backpacking through foreign countries. She'd even landed a relationship that lasted 6 months, built on a foundation of borrowed experiences and stolen personality traits. When I confronted her about this pattern, Jennifer became defensive and then angry. "You're being ridiculous," she snapped. "Stories aren't copyrighted. Everyone shares experiences and learns from each other. You're just jealous that I'm putting myself out there while you're stuck in a boring relationship." The jealousy accusations stung because it contained a grain of truth. David and I had fallen into comfortable routines, and I sometimes missed the excitement of meeting new people and sharing my adventures with fresh audiences. But that didn't give Jennifer the right to perform my life for strangers on dating apps. Ended up taking screenshots of her profiles before she could change them. Partly for evidence, but mostly because seeing my life reflected through her lens was surreal and infuriating. She'd even stolen my sense of humor. Copying jokes and anecdotes I'd shared during our regular coffee dates, our friendship didn't survive the confrontation. Jennifer accused me of being possessive and controlling. I accused her of being a fraud who couldn't be trusted with personal information. We blocked each other on social media, and mutual friends were forced to choose sides or navigate awkward group dynamics. 6 months later, I heard through the grapevine that Jennifer had met someone Sarisa guy who was apparently charmed by her story about volunteering at a homeless shelter every Christmas. That was my story too, from my college years when I spent winter breaks serving meals instead of going home. I don't know if her relationship will last when he discovers the real Jennifer, the one without my experiences to make her interesting. Part of me hopes it will, because despite everything, I want her to be happy. But I also hope she's learned to build connections based on her own truth, not borrowed adventures from someone else's life. The experience taught me something unexpected. About friendship and trust, it's not just about keeping secrets, it's about respecting the boundaries between one person's story and another's. Some things aren't meant to be shared, even between close friends. Story 6.I accidentally was unmuted in a Zoom call, and now I am going insane. The morning started like any other Wednesday: coffee, shower, quick check of emails, before settling into my home office for what was supposed to be a routine quarterly review meeting. 23 people on the call, including our CEO, several department heads, and that intimidating woman from HR, who never seemed to blink during video conferences. I'd been working remotely for Thomson and Associates for 8 months, long enough to feel comfortable with the rhythm of virtual meetings. Mute myself, turn on the camera, nod thoughtfully during presentations, unmute briefly to contribute when necessary. It was a system that worked perfectly until it didn't. The call had been dragging for 45 minutes. Our CFO, Patricia Williams, was deep into a presentation about budget allocations that could have been an email. I'd stopped paying close attention around the 30-minute mark, instead scrolling through social media while keeping one ear tuned for my name or department. That's when my neighbor's dog started barking. Rex, a German shepherd with the vocal, the stamina of an opera singer, had apparently spotted a squirrel or mailman or blade of grass that offended him. The barking was loud enough to wake the dead. and I could see other participants glancing around their screens, clearly hearing the noise. Without thinking, I leaned toward my computer and muttered, "Oh, for fuck's sake, shut up, you stupid dog." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 faces stared back at me through my screen, expressions ranging from shock to barely contained laughter. Patricia had stopped mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open. Our CEO, Richard Thompson, looked like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or amused. I am so sorry," I stammered, frantically checking my mute button, which clearly showed I'd been unmuted the entire time. I was talking to my neighbor's dog, I wasn't referring to anyone on this call, as "we'll take a 5-minute break," Richard said smoothly, though I could see the corner of his mouth twitching. "Everyone please mute while we're paused." The call disappeared, leaving me alone with my mortification and the continuing soundtrack of Rex's barking. I sat there for several minutes, head in my hands, replaying the moment over and over. Had I really just called someone a stupid dog in front of the entire executive team? Had I used profanity in a professional meeting? Was I about to be fired for insulting a neighbor's pet that my colleagues had mistaken for a commentary on the presentation? When the meeting resumed, I kept my camera off and remained muted for the duration. Every few minutes, someone would make a comment that seemed to reference my outburst. "I hope we're not barking up the wrong tree with this budget proposal," Patricia said, with what sounded like deliberate emphasis. "We don't want to unleash any unexpected reactions," the puns continued. Throughout the remaining 30 minutes, "Let's not bite off more than we can chew. We should probably leash our expectations. This proposal shouldn't ruffle anyone's fur." I couldn't tell if they were intentionally making dog references or if my paranoid brain was finding patterns where none existed. After the call ended, I immediately texted my work friend Angela. "Did that just happen, or am I having a nightmare?" "Oh, honey," she replied, "it happened. The Slack channels are already buzzing." My stomach dropped. Slack channels, plural. I opened the work messaging app and found exactly what I feared. Multiple threads discussing my outburst, complete with crying laughing emojis, and speculation about whether I'd been talking to a pet or a family member. Someone had already created a GIF of a cartoon dog with the caption, "Stupid dog says what?" The worst part was the ambiguity, because I'd said, "Shut up, you stupid dog," without clearly indicating I was addressing an animal. Several colleagues seemed to think I'd been commenting on the meeting itself. A few messages suggested I'd been calling Patricia a stupid dog, while others speculated I'd been insulting a family member who'd interrupted my workspace by lunch. The story had evolved into legend. According to office gossip, I'd either insulted our CFO, verbally abused a relative, or had a complete professional meltdown over budget presentations. None of these versions mentioned the actual culprita, neighbor's dog, with poor timing and excessive vocal enthusiasm. I spent the afternoon crafting and recrafting an email explanation to the entire team. Every version sounded worse than the last. I want to clarify that my comment was directed at my neighbor's dog, made me sound like I was making excuses. There was a misunderstanding about who I was addressing, sounded evasive. I apologize for any confusion about my off-camera remarks. Seemed to acknowledge wrongdoing. I wasn't sure I'd committed. Finally, I decided on honesty. I sent a brief message explaining that my neighbor's dog had been barking loudly, that I'd thought I was muted, and that my frustrated comment had been directed at the animal, not at any person or presentation content. I apologized for the distraction and unprofessional language. The responses were mixed. Most people were understanding and shared their own work-from-home horror stories. A few seemed disappointed that the real explanation was so mundane. Patricia herself replied with good humor, saying she'd been called worse things by better people and appreciated the clarification, but the damage to my professional reputation felt permanent. Every subsequent meeting, I triple-checked my mute button every time someone made a comment that could possibly be interpreted as dog-related. I wondered if they were referencing my moment of infamy. The incident became my defining characteristic at the company. I was the person who'd accidentally called someone a stupid dog in front of the CEO. 3 weeks later, Richard mentioned the incident during a company-wide meeting about remote work etiquette, using it as an example of why we should all be more careful with our mute buttons. He didn't use my name, but everyone knew exactly which incident he was referencing. 6 months have passed, and people still occasionally bark softly when I join video calls. It's become a running joke that I've learned to laugh about, but part of me still cringes every time someone's pet makes noise during a meeting. I've become hypervigilant about my audio settings, probably checking my mute status more often than necessary. The irony is that Rex, the dog whose barking started this whole mess, moved away with his family 2 months ago. But my reputation as the person who had a public meltdown about a stupid dog will probably follow me for the rest of my tenure at Thompson & Associates. Sometimes I wonder if I should just lean into it and get a custom Zoom background with cartoon dogs. Story 7. My boyfriend got an email from Tinder saying couldn't stay away. The notification popped up on Brian's laptop screen while he was in the shower. We'd been living together for 8 months, and it wasn't unusual for me to use his computer when mine was updating or charging. I was just trying to check my email quickly before we left for dinner with his parents. The Tinder logo in his Gmail sidebar made my stomach clench before I'd even processed the subject line. Couldn't stay away, huh? It read, followed by welcome. Back to Tinder, your profile is now active. I stared at the screen, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Brian and I had been exclusive for over a year. We'd had multiple conversations about deleting dating apps when we decided to be official. I distinctly remembered him showing me his phone as he removed Tinder, Bumble, and Hinge, joking that he was closing down the shop because he'd found everything he needed in me. The sound of the shower running seemed to get louder as I sat there, frozen between curiosity and respect for his privacy. The email was right there, unopened, waiting. All I had to do was click on it to see when he'd reactivated his account, maybe even get a glimpse of what his current profile looked like. Instead, I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I poured myself a glass of water. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it was an old email that had just been delayed. Maybe Tinder automatically reactivates inactive accounts after a certain period. Maybe someone had hacked his account, but even as I ran through these possibilities, I knew I was grasping at straws. The email was dated today, sent just 3 hours earlier while I'd been at work, and Brian had been home with a mild cold he'd been nursing for the past 2 days. When Brian emerged from the shower, humming some song I didn't recognize, I tried to act normal. We got ready for dinner, and I listened to him complain about his stuffy nose and joke about how his mother would probably try to feed him soup. Even though we were going to a steakhouse, he seemed completely relaxed, affectionate even, kissing my forehead as I fixed his collar. Dinner with his parents was torture. Patricia and Robert Davis were lovely people who always made me feel welcome. But I sat through 2 hours of conversation about Brian's promotion at work, their upcoming vacation plans, and Patricia's new garden, all while that email subject line echoed in my head. Couldn't stay away, huh? The casual cruelty of that phrasing bothered me almost as much as the implications. It suggested Brian was a repeat offender, someone who regularly cycled through periods of deactivating and reactivating his dating profile. How many times had he done this during our relationship? How many breaks had he taken from our commitment while I remained blissfully unaware? That night, I lay awake listening to Brian breathe beside me, studying his sleeping face in the dim light from our alarm clock. This was the man who'd told me he loved me 6 months ago. The man who'd brought me flowers last week for no reason other than seeing them at the grocery store and thinking of me. The man who'd spent the previous evening planning a weekend trip to visit my college roommate, enthusiastically discussing which restaurants we should try, and whether we needed to bring hiking boots. How did that version of Brian reconcile with someone who was browsing other women's profiles on dating apps? I waited until the next evening to confront him, after spending the entire day at work rehearsing different approaches: direct accusation, casual inquiry, setting a trap by asking if he deleted his dating apps. I saw a Tinder email on your laptop yesterday, I finally said while we were washing dishes after dinner. It said something about welcoming you back. Brian's hands stilled in the soapy water. What were you doing on my laptop? Checking my email. Your computer was closer. I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. So what was that about? The silence stretched long enough that I started to feel foolish. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there really was an innocent explanation. I can explain, Brian said finally, which was possibly the worst response he could have chosen. In my experience, People who could explain, usually just explained instead of announcing their ability to do so. The story that emerged was complicated and unsatisfying. Brian admitted he'd reactivated Tinder 2 days earlier, during what he called a moment of weakness while he was homesick and feeling sorry for himself. He claimed he'd just wanted to see if any of his old matches were still on the app. Out of curiosity, more than any serious intention, he swore he hadn't messaged anyone or set up any dates. "But you were planning to," I said, "and it wasn't really a question." Brian's shoulders sagged. "I don't know, maybe. I've been feeling weird lately, like we're getting too serious too fast. Living together, meeting each other's families, talking about the future. Sometimes I wonder if I'm missing out on something." The honesty was brutal and somehow worse than if he'd just lied. At least a lie would have meant he valued our relationship enough to protect it. This felt like he was asking permission to explore his options while keeping me as a backup plan. "So what do you want to do?" I asked. "Do you want to be single? Do you want to date other people?" "I want just you," he said, which was probably the most devastating thing he could have said, but I'm not sure I'm there yet. We broke up that night, not dramatically or angrily, but with the quiet sadness of two people who cared about each other but weren't in the same place emotionally. Brian moved out the following weekend, taking his laptop and, presumably, his active Tinder account. 3 months later, I saw him at a coffee shop downtown with a woman I didn't recognize. They looked happy, comfortable with each other in that new relationship way that's all stolen glances and casual touches. Part of me wondered if she was someone he'd met on Tinder during one of his previous reactivations, or if she was a completely fresh start. I never did find out how many times he'd cycled through dating apps during our relationship. But that email subject line taught me something important about the difference between choosing someone and settling for them. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" Implied a pattern of leaving and returning, of treating commitment like a revolving door. Deserved better than someone who had to keep checking if the grass was greener elsewhere. Story 8. My friend wants me to invite another friend to our crafting night, but I'm not comfortable doing so. But I feel like I'm between a rock and a hard place. Every Thursday evening for the past 2 years, Michelle and I have gathered in my living room with our knitting needles, embroidery hoops, and whatever craft project is currently consuming our attention. It started as a way to stay connected after college, when we both found ourselves working demanding jobs that left little time for the friendship that had sustained us through 4 years of late-night study sessions and weekend adventures. Our Thursday nights became sacred. We'd order takeout, spread our supplies across my coffee table, and spend 3 hours creating things with our hands while catching up on everything happening in our lives. Michelle would work on her elaborate cross-stitch samplers while I fumbled through beginning knitting projects, both of us talking through work frustrations, family drama, and the general challenges of navigating our mid-20s. One of these evenings last month that Michelle brought up Amanda Peterson, a coworker who'd recently started at her marketing firm. "She's really into crafts too," Michelle said, carefully threading a new color into her needle. "She does amazing watercolor work, and she mentioned wanting to find other creative people to hang out with. I was thinking maybe we could invite her to join us sometime." My stomach tightened immediately, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Oh, that's nice that you've found someone with similar interests at work, right? She seems really cool, very artistic, super creative. I think you'd like her." But I wasn't sure I would like Amanda Peterson, and more importantly, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. Thursday nights with Michelle weren't just about crafting. They were about having a safe space to be completely ourselves, to share thoughts and feelings we wouldn't dream of expressing to newer acquaintances or casual friends. These evenings were where Michelle had first admitted she was thinking about breaking up with her long-term boyfriend, where I'd confessed my growing anxiety about my career path and whether I'd chosen the wrong field entirely, where we'd both ugly cried over family issues, relationship problems, and the general uncertainty of adult life. The intimacy of those conversations had been built over years of trust and shared history. Adding a third person, especially someone neither of us knew well, would fundamentally change the dynamic of what had become my most treasured weekly ritual. Out how to explain this to Michelle without sounding selfish or territorial. She was clearly excited about Amanda, had mentioned her several times over the past few weeks as they'd bonded over work projects and lunch conversations. Refusing her request to include Amanda in our crafting nights would feel like rejecting this new friendship that was bringing Michelle joy. Maybe we could all grab dinner sometime instead, I suggested. It might be easier to get to know each other in a different setting first. Michelle looked at me strangely, but she's specifically interested in crafting. That's how we bonded in the first place, talking about our projects. It would be perfect to have her join us. Perfect for whom, I wondered? For Michelle, who was clearly enjoying having another creative person in her daily life. For Amanda, who would get instant access to an established friend group and weekly social plans. But not perfect for me, who valued the exclusive, intimate nature of what Michelle and I had built together. Over the following weeks, Michelle brought up Amanda regularly. Stories about their collaborative work projects, funny things Amanda had said during team meetings, photos of Amanda's latest watercolor paintings that were apparently absolutely stunning. It became clear that this wasn't just a casual workplace friendship. Michelle was genuinely excited about this new person in her life, and that made my reluctance feel even more selfish. I started researching the psychology of friendship groups, reading articles about how introducing new people can strengthen or weaken existing bonds. Some sources suggested that expanding social circles was healthy and brought fresh perspectives to stagnant relationships. Others warned that intimate friendships could be diluted by adding people who didn't understand the established dynamics and shared history. The more I thought about it, the more I realized my resistance wasn't really about Amanda at all. It was about my fear of losing something precious and irreplaceable. Michelle and I had created something special in those Thursday evening hours. A weekly sanctuary from the chaos and performativeness of daily life. I was terrified that adding a third person would mean we'd have to edit ourselves, present more polished versions of who we were. What if Amanda was one of those people who dominated conversations? What if she judged our amateur crafting skills or found our deep, personal discussions uncomfortable? What if she was perfectly lovely, but simply changed the energy of our space in ways that made it feel less safe or authentic? The situation came to a head 3 weeks ago when Michelle directly asked, "So when should we invite Amanda to crafting night? Maybe next Thursday?" I felt cornered, forced to either give in to something I didn't want or risk hurting Michelle by explaining why. Wanted to keep our tradition exclusive. The pause before my answer stretched long enough that Michelle's expression shifted from hopeful to confused. I'm not sure Thursday nights are the best fit for that," I said finally, immediately hating how awkward and defensive I sounded. Not, "What's wrong with Thursday nights?" And there it was, the question I'd been dreading. How do you tell your best friend that you don't want to share your special time together without sounding possessive or antisocial? How do you explain that some relationships are meant to remain small and intimate without making it seem like you're judging her other friendships? "It's not that there's anything wrong," I said carefully. "It's just that Thursday nights have become this really specific thing for us, and I worry that changing the dynamic might, I don't know, change what makes them special." Michelle's face fell. "You don't want to meet Amanda. It's not about Amanda specifically. I'd feel the same way about anyone we added to something that's been just us for 2 years." But even as I said it, I could see how it sounded from Michelle's perspective. She was excited about a new friend and wanted to integrate different parts of her social life, which was completely normal and healthy. My resistance probably seemed unnecessarily rigid and exclusive. We didn't resolve it that night. The conversation ended with Michelle saying she understood but looking hurt, and me feeling guilty but still unwilling to compromise on something that mattered so much to me. Since then, our Thursday nights have continued, but there's been a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Michelle still comes over, still brings her cross-stitch projects, still shares what's happening in her life. But she's mentioned Amanda less frequently, and I sometimes catch her looking at me with an expression I can't quite read. Being selfish, I know that healthy friendships should be able to accommodate growth and change. I know that my fear of losing what Michelle and I have might become a self-fulfilling prophecy if I'm too rigid about protecting it. But I also know that some things are worth protecting, even if that protection requires difficult conversations and potentially uncomfortable boundaries. Thursday night crafting with Michelle represents something I didn't know I needed until I had Etta. Weekly reminder that adult friendship can still include the kind of deep connection and unconditional acceptance I thought I'd left behind in college. Maybe the answer isn't a flat no to Amanda joining us, but rather finding ways to honor both Michelle's desire to expand our circle and my need to preserve what we've built. Maybe we could have Amanda join us once a month, or alternate between our regular intimate evenings and larger craft gatherings that include other people, or maybe I need to trust that real friendship is resilient enough to survive change. And that Michelle and I have built something strong enough to incorporate new people without losing its essential character. I still don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that next Thursday, when Michelle comes over with her latest project, I'm going to tell her we should figure out a solution together, instead of leaving her feeling excluded from a decision that affects her too. Story 9. My grandma received a letter in the mail with human fingernail clippings. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with Grandma Rose's usual collection of medical bills, grocery store circulars, and letters from old friends. I was sorting through her mail during my weekly visit, a routine I'd taken over 6 months earlier when her arthritis made it difficult for her to manage. The small print and numerous envelopes that arrived daily. At 84, Grandma Rose still lived independently in the same house where she'd raised my father and his 3 siblings. Sharp as a tack mentally, but increasingly frail physically, she'd finally accepted help with tasks like grocery shopping, house cleaning, and mail management. I'd volunteered for mail duty partly out of love and partly out of practical concern. She had a tendency to throw away important documents while keeping every sweepstakes, notification, and charity solicitation that crossed her doorstep the envelope. That changed everything was unremarkable at first glance. Plain white business envelope, Grandma's name and address, written in careful block letters with blue ink. No return address, which wasn't unusual. Plenty of marketing mail came without clear sender identification. The postmark showed it had been mailed from our city 3 days earlier. Anything interesting today? Grandma called from her favorite armchair where she was working on a crossword puzzle with the dedication of someone solving world hunger. The usual stuff, I replied, opening what I assumed was another insurance company trying to sell her supplemental coverage. She didn't need. The envelope contained a single sheet of plain white paper folded once. When I unfolded it, several small crescent-shaped objects scattered across Grandma's kitchen table. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then the smell hit me, slightly stale, unmistakably human. Fingernail clippings, at least a dozen of them, carefully collected and sent through the U.S. Postal Service. To my grandmother's home address, the paper contained a single line of text in the same block lettering as the envelope. "I've been thinking about you," Rose stared at the message and the scattered nail clippings, my mind cycling through possible explanations. A prank from one of Grandma's friends, some bizarre new marketing tactic. A mistake maybe. The envelope was meant for someone else entirely. But as I looked more closely at the handwriting, a chill ran down my spine. The letters were formed with deliberate precision, the kind of careful penmanship that suggested significant time and attention had been devoted to this message. This wasn't a casual prank or random act of weirdness. Someone had collected their fingernail clippings, written a personal note to my grandmother, and mailed them with clear intentionality. "Emma, everything all right over there?" Grandma's voice snapped me back to the present. I quickly folded the paper over the nail clippings, my hands shaking slightly. "Yeah, just ... junk mail. Nothing important." But it was important, in the most disturbing way possible. Someone knew my grandmother's name and address. Someone was thinking about her specifically, intimately enough to send biological material through the mail. The phrasing, "I've been thinking about you, Rose," suggested familiarity, maybe even affection, which somehow made it worse than if it had been obviously threatening. I excused myself to the bathroom and immediately called my father. "Dad, something weird just happened with Grandma's mail." "Weird how?" "Someone sent her fingernail clippings, like actual human fingernail clippings, in an envelope with a note." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, Dad said, "What kind of note?" I read him the message, my voice barely above a whisper, even though Grandma was in the next room. Dad's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Call the police. Document everything. Don't let Grandma know what had happened until we understood more about the situation." Officer Martinez arrived within an hour. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes, and the demeanor of someone who'd seen enough strange things to take my report seriously without seeming overly alarmed. She photographed the envelope, the note, and the scattered clippings, carefully bagging everything as potential evidence. "Has your grandmother mentioned anyone new in her life lately?" Officer Martinez asked. "Someone from church, a new neighbor, maybe a service provider." I ran through Grandma's limited social circle in my mind, her church friends, all of whom she'd known for decades. The grocery delivery person, who was a cheerful college student named Tyler, her cleaning lady, Maria, who had been coming monthly for 3 years, Dr. Peterson, her longtime physician, the postal carrier, Jim, who always asked about her garden. None of these people seemed like potential fingernail clipping senders. "What about former acquaintances?" Officer Martinez continued. "Old boyfriends, maybe someone from her past who might have recently gotten back in touch." That's when I remembered the phone calls. Over the past month, Grandma had mentioned getting several calls from someone claiming to be an old friend, though she couldn't quite place the name or remember how they knew each other. She'd attributed it to her aging memory and had been polite but brief during these conversations. She said the person seemed to know details about her life. I told Officer Martinez things about her late husband, about our family, but Grandma couldn't remember who it was. Officer Martinez's expression grew more serious. "We're going to want to talk to your grandmother about these calls. This could be someone who's been gathering information about her, possibly with concerning intentions." The conversation with Grandma was heartbreaking. When we explained about the package and showed her the photographs Officer Martinez had taken, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, fear. "Oh my," she said quietly. "Oh my goodness. Do you think it's Harold? Harold Winters?" The name came out in pieces over the following hour. A man Grandma had briefly dated 50 years ago after my grandfather passed away. The relationship had lasted only a few months before Grandma ended it. Disturbed by what she described as Harold's intensity and unwillingness to respect boundaries, "He used to collect things," she said, wringing her hands in her lap. "Little mementos from places we'd been together, a napkin from a restaurant, ticket stubs from a movie. I thought it was romantic at first, but then it became too much. He wanted locks of my hair, items of my clothing. When I broke things off, he didn't take it well." Harold had contacted her sporadically over the decade's Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, letters updating her on his life. Grandma had tolerated these communications out of politeness, never encouraging them, but not wanting to be cruel to someone who seemed lonely and harmless. But recently, the contact had increased. The phone calls had become more frequent and more personal. Harold had started mentioning details about Grandma's daily routine that he shouldn't have known: what time she got her mail, when her cleaning lady came, what groceries she'd been ordering, tea. "I think he might be watching the house," Grandma admitted, her voice barely audible. "The police investigation is ongoing." Harold Winters, now 78 and living alone in a senior community across town, was questioned but denied sending the package. However, officers found additional evidence in his apartment: photographs of Grandma's house taken from various angles, copies of old letters she'd sent him decades ago, and what appeared to be a detailed log of her daily activities. "Grandma is staying with my parents for now, and we've installed a security system at her house." The fingernail clippings turned out to be the least disturbing part of what Harold had been collecting. Police found bags of items stolen from Grandma's trash, including grocery lists, medication bottles, and personal papers. The scariest part is realizing how long this had been going on without any of us noticing. Harold's obsession with my grandmother had been growing for months, possibly years, hidden behind the facade of an old friend staying in touch. Have trusted her instincts about those phone calls, should have told us sooner about feeling watched. But how could she have known that politeness toward an old acquaintance would escalate into something so threatening? The fingernail clippings, it turned out, were just Harold's way of sharing something intimate with the woman he'd been obsessing. Over 4 or 5 decades, in his mind, sending pieces of himself was probably a gesture of affection. Understanding his motivation somehow makes it worse. Story 10. Am I overreacting, or is it normal for my boyfriend to go on a trip with 3 girls? The group chat notification popped up while Jake and I were having dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant. He glanced at his phone, smiled, and typed a quick response before turning his attention back to our conversation about weekend plans. Nothing unusual there, Jake. Had always been social. maintaining friendships from college, work, and various sports leagues he'd joined over the years. It wasn't until we got home that he mentioned the text had been about a ski trip planned for the following month. "The gang is organizing a weekend in Vermont," he said casually while loading the dishwasher. "Should be fun if I can get the time off work." The gang was how Jake referred to his college friend group, a mix of people I'd met at various parties and gatherings over our 2 years of dating. I knew most of them by name and had generally positive impressions, though I wasn't particularly close with anyone in the group myself. "That sounds great," I said. "Who's all going?" Jake paused in his dishwashing, and something in that pause made me look up from the magazine I'd been flipping through. "It's actually a smaller group this time. Just me, Ashley, Morgan, and Jessica." The guys couldn't get the time off. Ashley, Morgan, and Jessica. 3 women I'd met briefly at parties, all attractive, all single as far as I knew. The pause in Jake's response suddenly made more sense. He'd been calculating how to present this information in the least problematic way possible. "Be just you and 3 girls?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just me and 3 friends who happen to be women," Jake corrected, and I could hear the slight defensiveness creeping into his voice. "We've all been friends since sophomore year of college. It's not like I'm going away with strangers." Logically, I understood his point. These were established friendships that predated our relationship. Jake had never given me reason to doubt his faithfulness or question his boundaries with female friends. He'd always been open about his social plans and inclusive about inviting me to group events when appropriate, but a long weekend in a ski lodge with 3 single women still felt different from grabbing drinks after work or attending parties where other people were around. This would be shared meals, shared living space, possibly shared hot tub time after long days on the slopes. The intimacy level of a small group vacation was completely different from casual social interactions. "How do you think you'd feel if the situation were reversed?" I asked. "If I told you I was going away for a weekend with 3 guys from my college friend group?" Jake considered this for a moment. "I guess I'd wonder why you couldn't find any female friends to go with instead. Right? So you understand why this feels a little weird to me." What followed was our first real fight about boundaries and trust. Jake argued that I was being controlling and insecure, that true trust meant being comfortable with your partner having close friendships regardless of gender. I argued that certain situations naturally created intimate environments that could complicate even innocent friendships, and that being aware of those situations wasn't the same as being controlling. "Do you really think I would cheat on you?" Jake asked, and the hurt in his voice was genuine. "No," I said honestly. "I don't think you would intentionally cheat, but I think spending a romantic weekend in a cozy cabin with 3 single women who've known you longer than I have creates a situation where things could happen that nobody planned." The conversation ended without resolution. Jake maintained that the trip was completely innocent and that my concerns were rooted in insecurity, rather than legitimate relationship boundaries. I maintained that certain situations were inherently risky and that choosing to avoid them was a sign of respect for our relationship, not personal weakness. Over the next few days, I found myself researching relationship advice forums and asking friends for their opinions. The responses were surprisingly mixed. Some people thought Jake's plan was completely normal and that my concerns reflected trust issues I needed to work on. Others thought a couples-only cabin trip with 3 single women was inappropriate regardless of friendship history. My sister Kate was firmly in the inappropriate camp. "It's not about whether you trust Jake," she said during one of our phone conversations. "It's about whether Jake understands that certain situations can create problems, even for people with good intentions. Alcohol, hot tubs, shared bedrooms, late-night conversations, that's a recipe for drama, even if everyone starts with the best intentions." My friend Michelle disagreed. "If you can't trust your boyfriend to go away with friends, you have bigger problems than this trip. Either Jake is trustworthy or he isn't. The gender of his friends shouldn't matter if you really believe in his character." Both perspectives made sense to me, which made the situation even more frustrating. I did trust Jake's character, but I also believed that good people could make poor decisions in certain circumstances. Was it unreasonable to prefer that he avoid those circumstances altogether? The compromise we eventually reached satisfied no one completely. Jake agreed to stay in touch more frequently during the trip and to be mindful of how his actions might appear or make me feel. I agreed to work on my comfort level with his female friendships, and to trust that his commitment to our relationship was strong enough to withstand a weekend with college friends, but privately, I still felt uncomfortable. The week before the trip, I found myself checking social media more frequently, looking for photos or updates from Ashley Morgan or Jessica that might give me insight into their feelings about Jake or their expectations for the weekend. I also found myself second-guessing my own reactions. Was I being the kind of controlling girlfriend I'd always judged in other relationships? Was my discomfort rooted in legitimate concerns or personal insecurities I hadn't adequately addressed? The trip happened 3 weeks ago. Jake texted regularly, sent photos of the group skiing and eating meals together, and called me each evening to recap the day's activities. Everything seemed completely innocent and friendly, exactly as he'd promised it would be. But something has felt different since. He got back. Not dramatically different, but subtly shifted in ways I can't quite articulate. Jake seems more distant, more likely to mention inside jokes from the trip that I don't understand. He's been texting with Ashley more frequently, usually about shared memories or photos from the weekend. Maybe I'm imagining problems where none exist. Maybe the slight change in our dynamic is just the natural result of Jake having had a really good time with old friends, and I'm reading too much into normal post-vacation adjustment. Or maybe my original instincts were right, and certain situations create intimacy and connection that's difficult to contain within appropriate boundaries, even when everyone has good intentions. I still don't know if my concerns about the trip were reasonable or if I was overreacting to a perfectly normal friendship dynamic, but I do know that the question of what's normal in relationships is more complicated than either of us originally thought. The trip is over, but the underlying issue remains. How do couples navigate opposite-gender friendships in ways that respect both individual autonomy and relationship boundaries? I'm not sure Jake and I have found the answer yet,